maybe I'll start with telling you about United States artists, and then I can work backwards from there a little bit about my own experience and my own path in getting here, and then see what's useful and helpful to each of you, because I know each of you are kind of on your own path, and you're all doing different schools and different degrees, and you're at different stages of your degree. So let me know what's more useful to spend a little more time on. So United States Artists is a national arts organization, which in itself is unusual. There aren't a lot of national arts organizations at all. So, and most of them are a lot bigger than we are. It's strange because USA is sort of both very big and very small at the same time. We were founded in 2005, and something else that's sort of unusual about us is that normally arts organizations or nonprofits start with what my friend Julia, who works for a foundation, calls two chicks and a calculator, is like, two people huddled around like in a small desk building this thing from nothing. And the USA was the opposite. It was built by the presidents of 4 huge foundations, really led by a woman named Susan Beresford, who was the long-term president of the Ford Foundation, along with the president of Prudential, President of Rasmussen, and the president of Rockefeller. And they were all women, which is just a great coincidence and fun fact for me. And they were responding in large part to the devastating cuts that were made to the NEA to individual artists' support back in the early, or actually late 90s. So the cuts to individual artist grants was an enormous cultural crisis in this country. I don't know if most of you will remember that time, but it was a very dark time for the arts, and especially for artists. And artists never got that much money really from the NEA, but they could count on the NEA for that kind of support and validation. So it was responding to that. And then a very important seminal study that was done by the Urban Institute in 2003, I believe, called Leveraging Investments in Creativity, something like that. I can get you the exact the title of the study. But this study looked at 8 major art markets across the country and what were the leading obstacles that artists face in terms of getting success in their careers. And success for artists, obviously, it's a moving target because it's different for all of them. But it was things that any of you could guess, accessible healthcare, accessible workspace, money, obviously, but also validation was a really big thing to them. So when USA was being formed and the research was being done about how this organization should take shape and what it should address, these were the 2 areas that were key to the values of the early creation of the organization: access to unrestricted money and validation. And so built on that, we came up with, or my predecessor came up with, this formula of it being across the country, across every creative discipline, across all stages of career. And so as a result of that, that's been sort of our goal every single year. We've done this award now 9 times since then, and 50 awards of $50,000 each, so $2.5 million a year, given to the best American artists living today. And American artists, a lot of them are foreign-born. They just, what I always tell them is have to be able to cash the check in the United States. If they can do that, they're American enough for me. And it's literally every creative discipline. So while we have categories, the categories are more for logistical purposes than anything. But I mean, it's everything from dance, theater, literature, architecture and design, visual arts, obviously, and within each of those categories, media, within media, you have obviously documentary filmmaking, narrative film, but you also have a lot of radio, people in radio, and so each of them have a lot of subcategories, which is really interesting. And the fact that it's across all 50 states is very unusual. Although you can imagine that the concentration of people is usually on the coasts, we do have, at this point, winners in every single state except Vermont. Even though we've had artists nominated there, we haven't had a winner yet in Vermont or DC. And across all stages of career. So we have winners who have been in their 20s and in their 80s. Usually they're in their, I would say, 45 to 60 mid-career range, because it's based on a body of work that they're presenting. And it's by nomination. So that's also kind of unusual, is that we go out and find about 400 nominators a year all across the country in every discipline who make nominations. And then we bring expert panels to Chicago over the course of a few weeks who look at those nominations, and the artists submit work samples in a small application so they know they've been nominated. And then out of that big group of nominations, we call that down to the ones that we know will win, and then a number of alternates. And then the board and myself, we look at the alternates and we look at parity of, what's missing here. There aren't enough women, there aren't enough Native Americans, there aren't enough blues singers, whatever it is, we kind of try to balance the field. And as a result, I think I can say quite confidently that we are one of the most diverse groups of awardees of any grant maker in the country. You know, we have every year a majority of our winners are people of color, are minorities. We have almost 50% women winning every single year, which is pretty amazing in this kind of field. And we do that year in and year out, but it's really this very robust year-long process that we go through. And all of that is to really say that many times in nonprofits, and Caroline touched on this too, the operations piece is really the hard thing to sell to funders and to make people understand how important that is, that it's because of the expertise that we have on our staff and the time that we take to find those nominators and bring those panelists, and those panelists will come. You know, these are the head of every museum, head of music counts, head of everything that are coming here for these panels because they know how important this money is to these artists, that's what the organization, that's the heart of the organization, and that you need the people to power that organization. And that when I say we're very small, we're a staff of 5 people, but we have this very big footprint across the country, and we're very focused on this Fellows Award. So we've been doing this award since 2006 was the first year we gave it. And I came into the organization a year and a half ago. We were based in Los Angeles until a year and a half ago. And when I was interviewing for the job, I kind of also interviewed Chicago. You know, I kind of sold them on the idea that Chicago would be a great home for them. And I think in the life of a national organization, it's interesting to have it be uprooted and try a different ecosystem. And I think Chicago provides a really interesting environment because we are so strong across all the disciplines that we support. And philanthropically, it's such a strong city, and also it's not siloed the way that LA is and some other communities are, where, okay, this person gives in dance, they only give in dance. They won't also give in literature. That's not really the case in Chicago. I've already found that to be the case in the year and a half that I've been here, how supportive the philanthropic community has been here of the organization. And to just be in the middle of the country, it's just, it's nice. And our board is across the country too, so it's easier to get here than LA for many of them. So our mission is really to eliminate the value of artists to society. And in that study that I talked about earlier, one of the most shocking things that came out of that, and this was a 3-year national massive study undertaken by the Urban Institute, it found that of the respondents to the study, 97% of them valued art, while only 26% of them valued artists. And that disconnect was alarming, to say the least, and really oh my God, that's it. That's our mission. Our mission is to close that gap. How do we give artists the voice and the platform and the ability to become more important, in essence, to society, and kind of get out of their way. And I think with funding, for those of you who've had any experience in nonprofits, foundations, for a whole host of reasons, have a lot of strings attached to every single dollar they give you, and you have to report, and you have to justify, and you have to, budget, and all of these things that we're trained to do, but it hampers our work a lot of times. Imagine that times 1,000 for an artist who, when they're writing a grant proposal, the idea that they have for a piece is at conception, and it will change a million times by the time it's realized, and they have to justify that every step of the way to a funder. It doesn't make any sense. It's really counterintuitive for an artist to ask for money in that way. So while there are a lot of foundations who support art making, very few of them support individuals, and even fewer of them, I can count on one hand, support individuals this way, unrestricted. Here's $50,000, do whatever it is you want to do with this money. And over 10 years, we've been able to see the impact of that. So now I'm hopefully this year undertaking the first sort of longitudinal study that we've ever done over the first 10 years of what the impact has been of the award, and comparing it to other important awards that are out there that are a little more structured around a specific project, or you have to be with an organization, or whatever the case may be. So we're very unique in that respect. And when I took over the organization, we were very healthy. It was very different than when I took over CAC, that CAC was very unhealthy. In fact, was almost, about to die, really. And that was resurrected and then handed off to the very able hands of Caroline. USA was a much healthier organization, but it suffered from something different, which was that it just hadn't evolved very much over those first 10 years. It had done one thing very, very well, but it also was very isolated. You know, we didn't really play well with others. We didn't partner with anybody else, and we were kind of over there in LA, and nobody really knew who was there, and how did this money happen, and we weren't very transparent. And that was for a lot of reasons, but we were run more like an institution, and I was really interested in changing that and being more like what I am naturally, which is more entrepreneurial with the organization. So I sort of turned that on its head and said, okay, the Fellows Program has been a huge success for us. How can we now leverage that and respond to what the field is telling us now? And one thing was we had never re-engaged with our alumni, and we had at this point 400 of them around the country who had never heard from us again after $50,000 and a big fabulous party we threw them, and they never heard from us again. And what we knew, except we did check in with them at 6 months and 2 years just to see what they'd done with the money, but that was like an email. So one of the first things I did was to build an alumni advisory council. And this, I felt like, was a real litmus test, because these are people who we're never giving any money again to. So I didn't know if they would care to talk to us again or need us anyway. And the response was amazing. Every single person I invited, I put 13 people in the council. And these are ranging from, you know, Bill T. Jones, who's, you know, one of the most famous dancers in the world right now, to, you know, Barry Jenkins, who's a filmmaker, all kinds of great people. They all jumped at the chance to be on this council, to be a part of an organization who they all felt had really changed their lives in this way, and to help bring it forward. So that was one of the first things, in building an alumni program. In the past, we had done, and this is something you guys will find as you go to organizations, especially the big institution ones who rely on so much money to operate every year. It's really hard. The bigger the institution is, the harder it is for change to happen and for risk-taking to happen. So with USA, the beauty was that we could be much more nimble because we were small, and we had a board that was open to taking some risks. And so we had been doing for a long time a very expensive but largely meaningless award ceremony. And we'd bring all the winners to LA, and we would have this big, you know, highly produced, incredible event at the Getty or at the Disney Hall or something, and pay astronomical amounts of money for it. And because I always came from the 2 chicks and a calculator model of organizations, I was like horrified when I saw this money being spent on something that wasn't really impactful in any way, you know. So I changed that, and I created, with the council's advisement the entire time, a 3-day conference that was artist-driven for artists. And so we called that the Artist Assembly. And we did that in March here in Chicago. And it was a combination of excursions around Chicago, so partnering with the Poetry Foundation and with the Astor Gates, who won our award in 2012, and going to tour all of his Dorchester project spaces, and with Hubbard Street Dance and with Second City, and just with, you know, so many of the great organizations that exist in Chicago. And then we had a day of conference of kind of talking through major issues in the field that these artists were dealing with. And it was pretty successful. And we reached out, you know, to partner organizations to be part of it and to attend. And in that way, you know, felt that we were, it was kind of what I called our love letter to Chicago in a way, because we're not a Chicago organization. It was a way for us to be really involved in Chicago. So that conference, the assembly, will travel. And what I should say also is that it not only invited all the winners of this year, it also invited all of the alumni from the Midwest. So that was the first time the alumni had ever been asked to come back to anything. And many of them, you know, their response was like, why didn't we get this? Like, this is, you know, what's this? You know, and they loved it, which was great. And then in that idea and that spirit of partnership, which is something when you're a small organization you do out of necessity and to survive, and to bring that to a larger organization is a great experience for different reasons. We announced a new partnership with Rockefeller. They have a residency program in Italy called the Bellagio program on Lake Como. It's a beautiful space. And so we did, our first round will start this year, all the fellows to apply as collaboratives, as teams of collaboratives who want to do a project together, but what they need is space and time together. So we're sending them to Italy for 2 to 4 weeks. We picked 3 teams over this next year that will go. And this is really, I think, in terms of some wisdom to impart to you guys, what I think is so key when you're looking at to work with an organization, you look at what the strengths of that organization are. You know, what are the values of this organization? What can I leverage that's already here instead of building something new? You know, what's the like uncut diamond that's in front of me? And in terms of USA, it was the alumni one, but it was also that we are sitting on a pool, a cohort of 400 of the best artists in this country across every discipline, across 50 states. That cross-section of talent, people are going to want access to this. You know, other organizations are going to want access to this. And so to that assembly, I invited Jacob's Pillow, which is like the biggest dance festival in the country in Massachusetts. I invited the Sundance Film Institute. I invited Lower Manhattan Cultural Council and Rockefeller, because I knew that these are all people who are in the business of looking for talent. And dance people are only looking at dancers. But they know now the way that the field is shifting is that more and more artists, just like humanities, are wanting to work across these disciplines, or they're wanting to practice across these disciplines. So that was kind of the engine, you know, that kind of was really, for me, the impetus of what I thought we could be in this sort of USA 2.0 of the organization's future. So that's where I'm taking it, is really in these directions of collaboration, both for the organization and for the artists, looking at the alumni and building the award and having it be an award that has a longer term impact on these artists and not just a one-time major infusion of funds. So that's USA. This is the site. Just, I mean, you guys can go through it later, but here in the assembly, it tells you, I mean, you can see a little bit about kind of what we did each day here in Chicago. And then next year, we're going to Miami. That's where I'm from. So it seemed, I know everybody there, so that seemed a safe space to go next. And then we'll go out west after that. So I don't know, but little by little, we'll reach the whole country. And then here in Fellows, if you guys want to later, you can go through and see each year or by category each of the Fellows who have won. And if you click onto them, you can see all their bios. And it's just an extraordinary group of people, as you can imagine. So, you know, I'm very honored to do this work. And I think that in terms of fundraising and developing for this kind of thing, what I've really learned in being in an organization like this is that when you ask for money for something like this, or for any organization that is so important to the community, the position you should always take is that this is an opportunity for this funder. This is an honor for this funder, that this is something bigger than them, that this is beyond our lifetimes, that they're helping do something that's for a legacy, you know, that you're not like a handout. You know, this isn't like, oh, please save this organization. It's, you should want to be part of this, and this is why. And that's a hard thing to do in development, but you learn that over the years as you become more confident, but the sooner you can, the better. Learn that people who are philanthropic, they want to give, and so you have to sort of give them the reason why this is the right fit for them. And I mean, I could go into development for a long time, but that's a little bit on that and why Raising for USA is specific in that way. So that's USA. I don't know if I should go back sort of how I got here. Would that be useful? Yeah? Okay. So I'm from Miami, like I said, and I went to college for poetry and writing, actually, to the major fear of my father. It was like, what's going to happen now? So I went to study art, you know, to really be an artist myself. And then, like a lot of artists who come through that, realize I love to be around artists. I don't know that I'm so much a maker myself as someone who just wants to be in that world. So when I came out and I did a year abroad, and I came back from that, I went to work for PEN, which is the sort of preeminent writers organization in New York. They do a host of incredible work, First Amendment right issues, and a number of other things. But that was kind of one of the biggest sort of breakout opportunities that I had, because I got that job right out of college, and I was very young in New York City, and I was hired as a program coordinator, sort of like the lowest rung position. And then my boss quit. Like a month in, my boss quit. And the ED of the organization, I mean, there was like a lot of different departments. This was for a specific department. Didn't hire anybody for a year. So I de facto had to just come into that position on my own. And every other director was 25 years older than I was, but I just did it, you know, and I figured it out. And that's, I think, an example of, you know, if the opportunity's put in front of you, even if it's super scary, you just have to sort of take it, you know, and it ended up being a great lesson for me. And of course, I made a million mistakes, but he was busy looking at other things. He didn't notice most of them. So that was fine. But that organization, you know, was doing a huge amount of work around the country in terms of helping bring books and literature to very underperforming, under-resourced schools around the country. And that's the program that I ran for a long time called Readers and Writers. When I left there, I was at Penn for 4 years. And at Penn, I was allowed to sort of be a little bit entrepreneurial there too. I started a a book group program for women that were coming out of the prison system in New York, and I was able to start a number of programs that my director just kind of let me run with, and that was really great. That was a great experience in terms of knowing that I wanted to have my own organization. It paid me nothing, and I couldn't live on what they paid me, so I started a little catering company on the side, and that company basically what I saw was that Penn was doing all these writers' parties, like, for their awards, like all these things. I never had any food. So I was like, okay, I can do this. I can make the food for all these parties. And so I cooked parties for 200 people in my tiny little New York City kitchen with my partner, and we would take everything in taxi cabs, and like all my friends from college were our waiters. I mean, it was like breaking every health code violation, I'm sure, in New York City. But it was cash, and I made a lot of money, and that allowed me to have that kind of job, and like, it's just, again, like, you do what you have to do, and you're 23, so you have the energy. I could never do that now, but I was able to do it then. And so I did that for 4 years, and then I decided, okay, I need that next level of education. I'm looking for it. I always loved school, and I knew that I needed that to sort of get to the next level of where I wanted to go. And I had been a competitive debater in high school and in college, so law school had always been interesting to me. I didn't think that I wanted to practice, but I loved just the, sort of the essence and the spirit of law and law school. So I looked at MBAs. It didn't really seem the way that I wanted to go. Law school wasn't everything I wanted either, but there really wasn't a perfect path for what I wanted to do. So I went to law school. I went to University of Miami, and I'll never forget the first year I don't know if any of you guys have been through law school or know people who've been, I'm sure you know people who've been through law school, but the first year they have this thing called OCI, which are on-campus interviews, which is just like death by 1,000 cuts. Like, it's horrible. Like, you have to, like, one after another interview with these, like, really mean people from the state's attorney's office or from the DA or from, big firms. And they're just like, it's like a rushing process, like, to try to get you to have no feelings by the end so you can go into one of these jobs. And so I looked at the choices on the OCI, and there was nothing there that I wanted for myself. So I went to the job placement office, and I said, well, what is somebody who wants to be in the arts in general? Because I didn't have to be visual arts. I'd come from literature, but I was interested in anything, like you guys in the humanities. And they said, blank stare, like, nothing. We can't help you at all. Like, unless you want to go to the DA, the state's attorney, or a big law firm, we have nothing for you. Okay, so fine. So I decided spring semester of my first year of law school, I was dating an artist, so of course a lot happens that way, like when your love life and your personal life sort of collides with your professional life. What had happened in Miami at that time was Art Basel. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with this enormous art fair that was born in Switzerland and now is also in Miami every December. I was there from the beginning in Miami for Art Basel. And what happened was a lot of artists who I knew through my partner and through our friends were suddenly getting a lot of attention, and they weren't equipped to deal with it. They had no business acumen. They just had no idea how to deal with it. So I started as an independent study project in my spring semester of school, an organization called Legal Art. This was the two chicks and a calculator, me and my partner, Laura O'Neill. So this organization was a project. It was just a semester-long independent study project. And I tell people a lot who are in school, this is the time to start something, because there's not a lot of pressure on you to succeed or to make a lot of money because you have loans or other things that are paying for your roof every single day. And it's a good time to sort of start something. This organization ended up being what I did for a job for the next 6 years. It grew into a real legitimate organization. It's now called Cannonball. And it started with a very basic premise, which was to connect practicing lawyers in Miami with artists who needed legal help, and they would barter artwork for legal services. And it was for any kind of legal-related matter. So imagine in Miami, we had a lot of immigration cases. We had family law cases. We had, of course, labor law, legal, contracts, all that kinds of stuff. And by virtue of this happening for years, we ended up seeing all these lawyers becoming collectors of Miami artists. So that was actually a really cool byproduct of this system. That organization ended up becoming a lot more than just the Legal Link program. That was called the Legal Link program. I started a seminar program, which was professional development. This was in the early days of professional development, like what CAC does now. In those days, nobody did. And in fact, artists kind of didn't want anything to do with professional development. We don't need to do budgeting. We don't need to do marketing. Like, they would just, it was like somehow, discrediting the work they were doing, to be worried about business. That's no longer the case, really, for most artists. But it was then. And then what often happens, which is how I get obsessed with certain ideas, an artist friend of mine, a married couple, they're both artists, said, Carolina, we have nowhere to work. Miami's just getting too expensive and we have no workspace. So that then was like a seed in my head that I couldn't get out of my head. And I was like, okay, I need to have a building. We need to make a building for these artists. So that's how this organization really grew. Let me go into, Legal Link is what I just told you guys, which was really and then the residency. Let's see. So we moved into a building in 2006. Well, these are all the current residents in Miami, next to a huge strip club, which was the only area where we could afford, and built out 7 apartments. And so each apartment, 4 of them were saved for Miami artists, 2 of them for national, international artists, and 1 for a scholar or a curator or a writer, or somebody who would come in and sort of program with the rest of the artists. And the artists live there for a year. The Miami artists live there for a year. The international, national are there from a month to 3 months, and same with the curator. And they pay $100 a month, all expenses, everything covered with that. And they have incredible space. They have access to the city. They have all kinds of things. And so we're now 12 years old. I'm still on the board of that organization. I left it 6 years ago to move here. And I'm very proud of it. And I'm really proud of what's happened there. The director now, Chris Cook, is a dream. When you found an organization, you can really only do so much. I think Caroline put it so well when she was talking about the Arts Council in Michigan. And also as a personal leader, you kind of have to know, like, okay, I've done what I can do for this organization. If I keep growing it my way, it's almost a detriment to it. And the director who's there now just did an incredible amount of new programming. This whole school that he has, Wavemaker grants, all this stuff that he's brought to it has been really great. So that's part of like the life cycle of an organization. It changes with each leader, and that's really a big reason why leaders are so important, because they bring their own vision to that organization. So I did Cannonball for a number of years, and then I came to Chicago and took over CAC. And I think you guys know a lot about CAC now because Caroline shared that with you. But again, that was kind of an organization that was very small, and had become really irrelevant in Chicago, but had a super rich history. And I think one of the important lessons that I learned there is that, because I was going to start something here, my instinct was to start an organization because I had done that well in Miami. And instead, I was talked into by some people here in the city to try to revive CAC. And I think that the really valuable lesson was there that it's easier to turn around a broken brand than to build a new one from scratch. It takes longer to build a brand from nothing, especially in a big city like this. So everybody knew CAC, even though most of them thought it was irrelevant or whatever, it was passé or was for Sunday painters or whatever they used to say about it. It was still there. People knew what it was. It was in the ether, right? So turning that around was what I did for the first couple of years, and then we moved into this fabulous space that really changed everything. And I think it's okay that I think the organization has to move now, because it served that purpose. That space served its purpose of kind of putting us back on the map, putting that organization back on the map in people's minds as a relevant modern organization for working artists today. So that was a great experience. And then USA came along, so here I am. That's the trajectory. I want to give you guys enough time, so I won't say anything else. I'll just take questions if there's any way I can be helpful. Yes?
I'm really curious about this residency program. It sounds like a really amazing project. And so if the idea came to you by artists saying they weren't able to afford to stay in Miami, coming from New York, I know that's like the same situation there. And I know some people are taking the organizations and moving them to less expensive cities. But in order to stay in the city, first of all, how did you build funding specifically for this project? And then are these artists applying just with basically their portfolio, or also on a need-based, are they showing like that they have need for housing that they can't otherwise support themselves?
So the first part of that, the funding for this, Miami is a really tough market to raise money in because there's almost no foundations there. There's one very big fish, which is the Knight Foundation. And then there's smaller, little community foundations and things. And it's a largely Latin community, as all of you guys know. And being Latin, I can say this, we're not a terribly philanthropic community of people. It's just not really in our history, our cultural DNA. And I think that will change over time in Miami, but it's a tough place to raise from individuals too for that reason. Chicago's very established with individuals. So in Miami, the Knight Foundation was really the one who funded that the building of that building and continues to be the main funder of that building. But then national funders came in and such. The artists apply regular application process with work. It's also a project. A big piece of this for me personally when I put it together was that to make an artist truly successful, I feel they should also be civically minded and giving back to the communities. So they have to come up with a community give back project. So that's also part of the application. Need is not factored in because it's a residency. I mean, the ones that live in Miami, I mean, it's got to be the right time, you know. So I think for artists, if they can seize on that, I mean, it won't work if you have a family. It won't work if, you know, it has to be the right time in your life. So we just assume they know what they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. This is totally connected to this. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about how you went about approaching these foundations with this project and just kind of what is necessary to kickstart something like this and how long it took you to get it running?
This Cannonball?
Yeah.
A lot of it is just dumb luck, I'm telling you, like, and just honestly asking. I think what you learn over and over in development is you have to have the chutzpah to ask, you know, and like and people want to be asked. And so whether that's a foundation or an individual, it's a hard thing to do. In the case of Knight Foundation, they had just launched a new initiative called the Arts Challenge. It's the Knight Arts Challenge. Now they've done it in a number of cities around the country, but it was massive at the time. And we got the biggest, I think to date, we got the biggest grant they've ever given. I think it was like $400,000, which helped us build this whole thing. But I mean, at the time, literally, I had hardly any funders at that time. It just happened to be an alignment of a foundation who wanted to see big risk takers and a big risk taker, you know, and so it just kind of aligned, you know. But before that, my first funder had been the Tremaine Foundation, which is a foundation in Connecticut. And how did I find Tremaine? I mean, I would just kind of like go through every other I would just kind of like troll the internet and like look for foundations that seemed like they would fund something, and I would just cold call people. Like I didn't know any other way. I hadn't been trained for any of this, so and in a way that was better, you know, because I was kind of clueless, and so I would call the Tremaine Foundation. Oh yeah, that kind of sounds up our alley, and then I'd write the grant proposal, and it worked. But I mean, those first couple of years, I made no money. And so you have to, I mean, that's just something you have to be prepared for if you go that route, as opposed to the USA kind of model where you look for the funding first and you build a business plan around the funding, which is what I would recommend, obviously, you know, if it's something you need to make a living from at the beginning. So I think, you know, it works differently, but I think what's so important is that you're being responsive to a real community need. And if you are, then the foundations will follow that. You know, it can't just be what you think is a good idea. You have to really know, this is why people are telling me this is what we need. And I'm always kind of listening to what people need. And that's what I respond to. It's not just because I think it's a good idea. And then the funding will kind of flow from that. I found that always to be true. Yeah. Any other questions?
I'd like to hear more about U.S. artists. One question is sort of the same question about U.S. artists. Does need come into your grant-making process at all?
No. In fact, we asked the panelists not to consider it. We ask the artists in the application what they would do with the money. And so sometimes it's hard to see, you know, I would pay for childcare. I would pay for, you know, like healthcare issues or whatever the case may be. But we try not to look at that as much as possible. You know, we really try to look at, would this money help them advance their practice? But advance their practice can mean a lot of things. You know, it can mean paying off the mortgage. It can mean, like, you know, buying the car or whatever it is. Those things all feed into the ability to do the best work. So that's why we really, once they're picked, we make no concessions, which is hard for some funders to swallow. I have an individual donor here whose family foundation, they're big, very wealthy family in Chicago, and the family foundation person kept saying, well, you know, when's the report going to be made, and how are you going to, you know, are they going to have to submit a budget? And I was like, no, like, you have to understand, like, this is completely hands off, you know, and that's the point. You know, you may not see the fruits of that for a long time. I just got back from Seattle for a board meeting, and we have alumni all over the country, so we always invite all the alumni from that city to come and have a dinner with us and some local, donors and stuff. So I called the writer Annie Proulx, and if you guys know who she is, she wrote Brokeback Mountain and Shipping News. She's an extraordinary writer, and she won our award a few years back. So I didn't know what she would be like. Writers can sometimes be a little ornery and a little isolated. So I was like, I'm not sure. So I called her and I was like, Annie, would you mind reading at our dinner? And she was like, are you kidding me? She goes, you guys saved my bacon. She goes, I literally just finished the book I was able to write because of this award. So she had lived for 3 years off of this $50,000 award, and she read from this book that's about to be published this year that spans 200 years and 100 characters. So you can imagine the kind of focus and time she needed for that book. And I had no idea that's what she used the money. I didn't know. We just trust them that they're going to do. But we hear this all the time, sort of these extraordinary things that if you just let them make the choices about how to use the money. I mean, I could tell you so many stories like that. So I think not looking at need, it shouldn't play into it so much. It's more looking at, have they shown the maturity to know how to make the decisions the right way that will advance their career. That's more what they're looking at, which is why I think that middle-aged, middle career is usually where most of the winners come out of, because we think there's still a lot of career ahead of them, but that they also have the maturity to know, what to do with this. Yeah.
And can you just say a little bit more about the nominating process? And you talked about the panel that actually makes the final decision, but sort of how artists get onto your radar.
Well, the Nominators. I mean, the Nominators, and it's tough. I mean, we have to find Nominators in North Dakota and Hawaii and Alaska, so and I travel all the time. So I'm always picking up Nominators everywhere I go, but our board does that for us. Automatically, when you win, the 50 artists that win, they're automatically Nominators the next year. But then we go back to Nominators who've nominated winners in the past, ones that have a good eye of the kind of artists that we're looking for. And so they are looking for, we're interested in this risk-taking, this innovation, this artists who are looking to push the envelope. A lot of times artists in this part of their career, if they've had success, oftentimes feel a little bit stifled because the market is telling them, oh, this is the kind of play that you should write, and this is the kind of music you should produce because this is what's worked for you. And so they want out of that box, but they don't, this award really gives them that license to do it, both monetarily and the validation. The fact that it's peer-to-peer like this is really key, and I think the value of it to them. And then once they're nominated, we tell them they're nominated. Some of these artists are living in the sticks. I mean, I literally had to hunt down an artist who lived in rural Puerto Rico through a board member who has a theater in the Bronx who's Puerto Rican, and this guy didn't speak, obviously I spoke Spanish, thank goodness, but we had to find him. He didn't have a phone. He lived in this little farm on the outskirts of whatever. He had to go to the little bodega to make the phone call. So it's really a major process getting these artists some of the time. So once we have their application, we just think that's already a huge victory. And then the panels are really expert people. We had the woman who started the hip hop archive at Harvard this year, who really is, the expert on hip hop, history of hip hop in the United States. So she was great to sort of look at the musicians who were coming in under that category. And once those panels are convened, they're here for a couple of days. They make the selection. So it's a long process, but
so the selection panels and the nominators are different.
Two different, right? And your nominators can be really anyone in the field, but the panels really need to be people who have 20, 30 years plus experience, because the panel can only be 5 people. So there's no way, if the woman who knows everything about basket weaving, she's not going to know everything about totem poles, so it has to be someone who, even if they are subspecialized, have been in the field long enough that they have a good awareness of everything else that's happening, and they can have, they fight. These are really intense conversations, and they go on for 8-10 hours, and I've been on panels before, and this one gets heated, really, really heated, because there's so much on the line, and they realize how much is on the line, and they really, obviously they really care. So that the expertise at the panel levels is a little more specific. Yeah.
So maybe you mentioned it, but do they get paid for it, the panelists?
The panelists do. Nominators don't. The panelists do, and that's very common because they're taking 2 days out of their work life to come. But it's $1,000. It's not anything extraordinary. The literature gets $2,000 because they have to read a a huge amount of stuff. So you can imagine it's many more hours we're asking them to invest. I had to do that for Rasmussen Foundation in Alaska. I was put on the literature panel, and it was like, oh my God, what did I get myself into, you know? Every time I got a poet, I was like, thank God. It's like so long. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit more about just like what the tasks that you have to undertake on kind of a daily basis or weekly?
Yeah.
Like, is it a lot of communication work? Just like connecting with people?
It is. I mean, I think when you get to the CEO level, executive director, CEO, whatever, that top sort of level, it's, I mean, I love how Caroline put it, that you're kind of making sure everyone's going in the same direction, but it's, your job has to change throughout the day. I think the hardest thing, the higher you go up in an organization, is the letting go of the minutia, you know, which is the fun stuff for a lot of us, you know, like how's that program going to look, and who's going to be there, and what's the seating look like, and what's the lighting look like, and what's the, you know, AV. Like, you can't get caught in those weeds. Like, it will kill you. Like, you have to be like, that's your problem. I have to go over here and deal on the the Magna level, which is a little bit hard to do, macro level I meant, when you come from that minutia level, right? So that day-to-day for me has been learning how to sort of pull back more, and I have to be more on the strategy a lot of the time. Working with a board. My board is very, very involved in our organization, so I have pretty regular contact with most of the board members. And then thinking, you know, through a strategic, I just built a 10-year fundraising plan. So that was like 6 months of my life, was building that fundraising plan, which now I'll start implementing. So, you know, I have to raise a new endowment and like all these other pieces. And you're always going to find stuff that you don't have the skill sets for. I mean, there's just no education that will prepare you for all of this. And so I've never built an endowment. This is my first time. So I had to spend a lot of time sort of learning about endowments. And I looked at community foundations to put the endowment, and decided, because you can't take any money out of it, that that's not a good path. So you have to really educate yourself about that stuff. But the day-to-day is so much about that sort of big picture thinking of where the organization is going. But the first time you do a program, you really do have to hold tight to it. The first time I did the assembly, I had to really be on top of every single thing, because it was my vision. You know, my name was on that. But now that I'm doing it a second time, I have to kind of pull back, you know, and allow them, to staff, to do the work that I trust them to do. One thing I should mention that's interesting about sort of, I think the direction education is going around things like this is, I was asked last year, well, it's 6 months ago, to come back to UM. UM is now, do you guys know what an LLM is? It's a master's of law. So basically it's like an extra year people do after law school in a subspecialty. So it's like maritime law or tax law, you know, something that you like really specific, right? So UM is developing, there's a couple that exist, but nothing like the one they're developing, an arts LLM. It's arts and sports law, LLM. And I'm on the advisory board that's helping shape the curriculum for this year-long program. And what they see is that there are so many lawyers who have gone into the arts field, who are running museums or are running symphonies or whatever, who have a great education like I do, but there's these missing pieces, you know, and like, what are the missing pieces to bridge between the JD and this career? So it's very exciting, this program, and it's starting this fall. And I'll teach a little course in it each year. But then the great thing is that it will send these lawyers out into the field, into working with organizations. But I think that's just in thinking about where you guys are headed. You know, I think all of academia is sort of looking at how to be more responsive to the arts world, because so many people want to work in that world, and there's a lot of need for different skills. Yeah.
So, you know, one thing that's been useful, I think, over the course of this is sort of just identifying what the jobs are out there, you know, like titles, things like that. So could you talk a little bit about the makeup of your staff in terms of the positions, and maybe especially positions that you might consider hiring somebody with an academic background?
Sure. I hate org charts. I really don't like thinking that way in terms of a team. You're sort of forced to, in a way, but just like I don't want categories of artists anymore, like I just want to get rid of them eventually. But for right now, they are necessary. We have, so I'm a CEO, and then we have a CFO, which obviously, and she also does HR. And then we have a director of the program, which is the director of the fellows program, and a program person that works for her. And then my executive assistant, who really is the de facto sort of like office manager. She really captures everything and does a lot of different roles in the organization. And then we have some interns, and now I'm hiring a development director. And then I will hire someone to manage the alumni program, and then that's it. We won't really have to grow beyond that. But I think with titles, I'm always on the fence about this, because I think when you're starting out, it's really important to fight for the title you need, because it does mean something out there, you know, to the world, and people do care. Like, I was the director versus the coordinator versus the manager versus the, you know, and like, but there's no, it's not like law. You know, my husband's a practicing lawyer, and law, for better or for worse, is super stagnated. Like, there's no mistaking where everybody is. You're a first year, second year, you're a junior partner, you're a senior partner. Like, everybody has their role, and it's very clear where everybody is. And that can be helpful. It also is one of the reasons they're, you know, tend to be behind in terms of a sector. But the arts doesn't have that. The nonprofits don't have that. Everybody sort of has their own, they invent their own org chart. You know, so a manager in one organization is very different than a manager in another one. But I think going in, I don't know, I mean, I think it's just so important to look at what the role is doing, you know, and that your skills are aligned with the role, because the title is often not that reflective of what the role is or what it will become. And in small nonprofits especially, and I would say small meaning like under 50 employees, under 30 employees, you should need to be prepared to do everything. You know, at some point in the year, you're going to have to just roll up your sleeves and help with the benefit. You're going to have to help with communications or the newsletter or whatever, because it's just there aren't enough people, which is fun. You know, I really look when I'm hiring for people who are okay with that, who don't need to be like, this is the box I'm in, oh, that's not on my job description. Like, that person won't last, because that person belongs in an institution, you know, where like there's very set, clear boundaries. And so you need to know that about yourself, that if you're a person who likes to know exactly what every day is going to look like, every month's going to look like, and you like the organization of that, a bigger institution is a better, you'll be happier there. And there's nothing wrong with that, you know, but it's a very different environments, the cultures of different organizations, even within one city, even within one discipline, even within one, you know, anything. I mean, they're all so different.
But would there be a value to you in somebody, say, who had a really broad sense of knowledge about arts in America,
Yeah.
who artists were, what the conversations are,
Okay.
without
I see.
the foundation?
So the education for me, what I'm looking for is more the hunger. Like, I'm looking for someone who's like really a curious mind, who is a lifelong learner, who is, you know, willing to do any job I throw at them, and trust me that I am looking out for their best interests, and that I'm very much a mentor and love to build people's careers. And I've shown that over and over. So I will, even if the day you have to do really mundane stuff, it's still all toward this goal. But I'm looking for the personality. And I think the education tells me a lot, because a PhD shows rigor, it shows hard work, it shows focus, it shows a lot of the traits that I'm looking for. But I wouldn't personally get that bogged down in what the actual degree was in so much most of the time, because the type of jobs that I'm looking for are so multifaceted. That said, I think that someone who brings in the experience of, you know, the rigor of the research and the analytical and the critical thinking skills that's so part of getting a PhD, that's very helpful in building any new program or an organization, because you need to do work to do that. You need to do research. You need to have the curiosity, but also the kind of patience that it takes to find the right answer and the best answer and all of that. And so I think that those skills are very translatable to nonprofits, but sometimes you're going to have to translate that for that employer and like sell them on, don't look at me like an academic, look at me as someone who has the skills that would be great in a small business or a big business, but a business nonetheless, you know. Yeah, that's what I would say, if that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could you, since you were talking about how people who work in smaller organizations have to wear many hats, have to have a flexibility of their portfolio, of what the kinds of work they're doing, and that the title isn't necessarily indicative of what they're going to be doing from a day-to-day standpoint. Could you maybe speak from the other angle about how some trends in the types of work nonprofits are doing? One thing that stuck out to me in what you were talking about was strategic planning, something that a lot of philanthropies now require to get a grant that might not have been the same 10 years ago. So if you could speak to what you see as different now for the nonprofit landscape, or what someone going into a nonprofit world would be facing today, or where you see it going in the next couple of years for people who might be looking for jobs in that sector.
Well, you're talking to someone who hates planning. I hate all types of planning. Shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who knows me. But other people love planning, and they love strategic planning. And so this is a big lesson in terms of hiring for me, is I hire to my weakness, always. And so everyone around me can do that kind of stuff because I can't. I just don't want to do it. And so what's interesting, though, I think, is that funders, and I've learned this, after all these years of doing this kind of work, they are looking for the answers as much as you are, right? And so a lot of times where they might say, we need a plan for this, or we need this done this way, they can be talked out of that if you really convince them, let me just do this, let me just take this ball and run with it, if you have a relationship with them, after a number of years. At the beginning, that's a little harder to do. What I do see, though, among funders, and a lot of this had to do with the economic crash, many of them had to shift, right? They're thinking about how they were making money. There were fewer dollars to go to more organizations. It was, it was a lot of soul searching and analysis of that kind of thing. But I think what came out of that, a positive thing that came out of that, is that I think a lot of funders started realizing the importance of operations funding, because that was sort of the weakest link of so many organizations, and also funding the leader and letting the leader lead. I'm seeing that a lot more among foundations. There's a newish president of the Ford Foundation, extraordinary guy named Darren Walker, and he loves sharing sort of his thoughts on stuff. Sign up for his newsletter if you guys want, if you guys can. But he sort of released his manifesto a couple months ago about where he wanted to take the Ford Foundation. And this is like, one of the biggest foundations in the world, so it's significant. Everyone's paying attention to if he's going to change direction. And it's very much based on this idea of building the infrastructure of the organization and letting the leaders lead, funding the talent in the organization. I hope that takes hold, because I think that's what funders need to do more, is kind of like what we do, which is just trust, have a system by which you're making sure that those leaders are trustworthy, and then let them do it, and I don't know that that's, I would call it a trend yet, but I'm seeing there's a group of funders that have been getting together sort of unofficially lately, a big presidents of major arts foundations getting together to look at this, how can we become more flexible and responsive? But it's hard for them because they're sitting on, $500 million assets or $1 billion assets, and they have a board who may not be so in touch with what's happening on the ground, and so it's difficult for them to get that down to the micro level of the organization. But I do see that changing a little bit. I really do. And I see individuals, there's a lot more family foundations being created every single day, and that's a really interesting trend, because they tend to be much more responsive and much more flexible, much more risk-taking, but also a lot less experienced. So you have to be patient with them in a way. So does that answer your question? I mean, I think the family foundation piece is really interesting trend. It's huge right now. I mean, they're growing all the time, individuals building foundations. And that's a good career path for people potentially too, is to run those family foundations. I think that's an interesting space to look in. I don't know where you'd look for those people, but I mean, it's becoming a very common way for very wealthy people to, park their assets and start to give them away while they're alive, Yeah. Was there someone over here?
I don't know how to formulate this exactly, but it's really refreshing to see the women in leadership positions. And so I've identified a couple avenues: grant writing, an entrepreneurial spirit, or getting into development. Are there other ways that, or perhaps also being in program, like for those of us who are still in academia but have enough time to dip our foot into one other thing that could be really strategic, could you speak to which of those avenues you see most often and what's most successful, or is it based on an individual interest, do you think?
I mean, I sometimes liken this to like the McDonald's franchise theory, which is like when you buy a McDonald's, you have to do all the jobs in the McDonald's before you're allowed to own the McDonald's. And I've always thought of building an organization that way. Like, it's really good to try to get a little bit of each piece of that. That may not be realistic at the point where you guys are in your career, But I think as PhDs, clearly you're strong writers, and development is where most of the writing of an organization has to come out, where the strongest writers should be, I should say, although it's important across all departments. Programming, development is, I don't know, I think it's so personality driven, a development person, because they're not the most creative one in the room. They're kind of helping the creative people make their vision happen. So if you're a really creative person, you might be frustrated in development because you're kind of helping the creative people build it. You're helping them build it though. And in the right organization, you're also giving a lot of creative input. But in some organizations, you're not given a lot of creative latitude in development. Again, I don't want to say that's true of all organizations. I think in good organizations, all these pieces sort of work well together. But in some, you will be sort of isolated that way. So that's just something to think about, that if you are very creative, like if you want to be building programs, programming is a better place to go. But development pays the highest after the executive level, always. So that's, just something to think about on a practical level, is usually the last person to be let go because they're the most necessary to the organization. There's a lot of stability in development, I would say, and you're very close to the executive director, you're very close to the board, you're given a lot of that sort of like high level access, which I think is really interesting. And a lot of development directors, like Caroline, become executive directors. I mean, that's a very common pathway, where I don't know that as many program people become executive directors. So it just depends also, like, what's your trajectory? Again, there's no rules, hard and fast rules to any of this, but that's just more, I would say, the trend. You're right that there aren't a lot of women in leadership still in the arts. Who was it that was it Mellon? I think Mellon just released a report on this about how the heads of so many, museums, unsurprisingly, are very white, very male. And what Mellon's trying to now do with the outcomes of that study in terms of their funding decisions. Mellon's a really interesting foundation. I think they're funding this, but they're very interesting in terms of they are very responsive. For being such a huge foundation, they're very responsive. And they just hired a woman named Ella Baff, who was the director of Jacob's Pillow, the dance festival I mentioned earlier, to be one of their, if not their senior arts person there, which I think is a really interesting decision, to bring a woman who had been running a dance festival into the foundation side. I think will be really interesting to see what Mellon starts doing, but it's an opportunity for women. I mean, and people of color, to be in these spaces where have not been dominated by that in the past. But I would, mentor, like find people who you think have somewhat of a path that you would like to see and spend time with them, because it can go any way, which is exciting and daunting. I don't know if that's helpful. This has just been my path. I've just always been kind of to my own drummer, kind of, beat kind of thing. Like I've just never really followed any set path, but certainly there are, more conservative ways to go, but I think development's always going to be a very stable way to go, Mm-hmm.
Maybe we could retire to the common area and
Yeah.
have some coffee
Yeah.
and some snacks and continue the conversation there. I think we're all set up, so.
Did you want to just add, I think we have one more.
Oh, yeah, sure.
It's very personal, so I can ask.
Oh, that's over there.